so I feel like, I'm sort of stepping in his footsteps. And when he was in his late 20s and 30s, I'm thrilled to be here, not least because my uncle, before his retirement, was a Congregationalist minister. And so I feel like, I'm sort of stepping in his footsteps. And when he was in his late 20s and 30s, he served a congregation in Stratford. So it sort of feels like, I don't know, maybe it's a family right to be up here. But I promise not to preach. Do you remember the TV show Frasier? The show about the psychiatrist who used to hang out at that bar, Cheers, in Boston. And then he got his own spin-off, and he moved back home to Seattle to start a call-in show. And he lived with his dad, who was always having misunderstandings because he was such a snob, but deep down, he was a big-hearted softie. I know, it's a TV show, but I talk about it with such familiarity because at one point, I had a borderline obsession with the show. I say obsession, and it was probably kind of unhealthy because the reruns aired on cable TV at 11 p.m., 2 shows, back-to-back, ending at midnight. And I watched that show every single night. I watched 11 seasons worth. I couldn't really figure out why I was feeling so compelled to do this either. I mean, the show's funny, but it's not that great. It's not worth staying up till midnight every night for, especially when I was starting out this new job and I really needed to be sharp. Only about 3 months in did it occur to me why I was so drawn to the show. Frasier had left a comfortable job and home and friends and moved to his hometown on the other side of the country. Wait a minute, I had just moved from Los Angeles and I was living in my hometown in Middlebury. Frasier was starting a somewhat bewildering new job hosting a call-in radio program. I was just starting a somewhat bewildering new job hosting a call-in radio program. Frasier was living with his father. I was living with my father. Suddenly, it all made sense. I was looking for some sort of shared experience, and I was watching ahead in this TV show to reassure myself that all the stress and fear and anxiety I was feeling was going to result in something successful, that I was making a good decision to move back to Vermont and start up this new show that VPR was just getting going. When VPR hired me, I had never hosted a single minute of live radio. I had been working as the director of Marketplace, the public radio business show based in LA, and I had been directing the live show for several years, and I'd been doing a significant amount of reporting on top of my directing duties. But actually standing in front of a live mic, broadcasting what I said as I said it, not a single second. So it was an incredibly nerve-wracking move. And Frasier, I guess, was just a kindred, albeit fictional spirit. There were some distinct differences between my life and Frasier's. While Frasier was trying to keep Eddie the dog off his precious furniture and getting in trouble trafficking in illegal caviar imported from Russia, my life looked a little different. I can remember one evening not long after moving back here. I was standing in the kitchen of my dad and my stepmother's house, mixing up a slick concoction of eucalyptus, lavender, and olive oils. Sounds like a great start to a really delicious recipe, but no, this was for slathering all over my scalp. I rubbed it in, and then I sat under a shower cap for the next couple of hours, trying not to drip on the furniture. I was 28 years old, I was living with my parents, and my 10-year-old sister had just given me head lice. Again. Kind of a different sitcom setup. I think at that moment I almost packed up my bags and just headed straight back for Los Angeles. But that was more than 12 years ago, and clearly I have stayed. And I'm still here because the job that I get to do is absolutely irresistible. I mean, there are definitely days where it feels like a slog, but I'm so lucky. I get to talk to interesting people every day for a living. Sometimes I can't believe my luck. I mean, think about it. I call up people who are doing something cool or newsworthy. I have a conversation with them. Other people listen to that conversation, and then someone pays me for talking to people. I mean, we are in between fund drives, so maybe this would be an opportune time to mention that those who listen to the conversation actually pay me, and thank you. Your donation in any amount is crucially important now more than ever. But honestly, I mean, what an amazing job. I just feel very grateful and so lucky. I actually knew it was going to be pretty special before I ever went on air on Vermont Edition. The first few months that I was here in 2007, it was summertime, and I was supposed to get up to speed on things before we actually started the daily show. So I was getting some training in how to use my voice, I was doing some research into local politics and culture, and going around the state to reacquaint myself with Vermont. So one of the very first interviews that I did was with Vermont's newly installed poet laureate. You may remember Ruth Stone. She lived in my hometown of Middlebury. So I called up her house, and it was one of her daughters who answered and said, "You're going to need to come to the house." And she sounded kind of apologetic. She said, "You know, my mom doesn't get around very well, and she's mostly blind." Well, that's no problem. So I went to Ruth Stone's house, and she was waiting with her daughter, Marcia, who, because it's Vermont, turned out to have been my guidance counselor when I was in kindergarten at Mary Hogan Elementary School. So I showed up totally green, not really knowing what to expect or how to do this thing that we call an interview. And I have to say, it got off to a rather inauspicious start. I've actually saved the raw audio file from that day, and I'm going to play a little bit for you here. This is as we were trying to sit down, and Marcia was helping her mother get settled, trying to say, you know, "Mom, this is what you can expect." And I was just about ready to start interviewing her when this happened.
But mostly I talk to your parents. This thing has gone dead. The cat went out.
Oh no.
Oh, Marcia. She can't hear. She can't hear.
She's running away from me. I'm not going to chase her.
Marcia, she can't hear.
All right, Ruth, let me move this microphone in front
I
of you.
can't hear, darling.
Let me
The
get it.
hearing aid is you put in.
So, in case you couldn't quite tell what was going on there, we now have a deaf cat who has escaped into downtown Middlebury, a daughter who's being yelled at, and a failing hearing aid. My first interview was not going very well. But Marcia got Ruth a different battery and a different hearing aid, and we sallied forth, and I was so charmed by Ruth Stone, absolutely fell in love with her. To this day, one of my favorite interview moments is when Ruth Stone started singing. It was guileless. I mean, it was this sweet, sort of breathy voice, remembering a tune from decades ago, word for word. And I'm going to play you the whole song. It is 2 minutes long, but it's one of my favorites, so I hope you'll bear with me. Here's what it sounds like.
I'd say I've lost 99% of what come to me. And that one, I have 3 daughters. Did I sing that one just now?
No. Would you like to sing that?
I'll sing it to you. I have 3 daughters, like green gauge plums. They sat all day, sucking their thumbs. And more's the pity, they cried all day. Why doesn't our mother's brown hair turn gray? I have 3 daughters, like 3 cherries. They sat at the window, the boys to please, and they couldn't wait for their mother to grow old. Why doesn't our mother's brown hair turn to snow? I have 3 daughters in the apple tree, singing Mama and Daddy with 3 young lovers to take them away from me. I have 3 daughters like green gauge plums, sitting all day and sighing all day and sucking their thumbs, singing, Mama, won't you fetch and carry? And Daddy, won't you let us marry? Singing, sprinkle snow down on Mama's hair, and Lordy, give us our share. Our share of what? That's a funny one.
I even love it today. I mean, I'm this 27, 28-year-old interviewer. I've never done an interview before, and here is this brilliant nonagenarian singing into my microphone. That was kind of my first hint that people were going to be willing to open up to a microphone, to me, and that somehow, even though it ought to make people clam up, it often makes them open up instead and show something of themselves that they might otherwise keep a little hidden. It's a real privilege. It's an honor to get to hear people's remarkable stories and sometimes start statewide conversations around ideas that are sparked by those stories. The extreme isolation one woman felt after going through many months of trying to get pregnant and then learning there was no hospital in the entire state of Vermont that would do IVF treatments for her because she had already turned 40. It wasn't so much her story that she wanted told. It was the pain and sadness that she felt and the feeling that she had to hide all of this grief from her coworkers and acquaintances. She told me about it, and then we did a show. We asked people to write in or call in and talk about their emotions, their experiences with infertility, and what they most wanted people to know about how to help somebody in that kind of situation. We planned a segment several years ago now about what was at that time still a relatively new drug treatment gaining in popularity called buprenorphine, sometimes known by the brand name Suboxone. And as I think probably everybody knows now, it's used to treat opioid addiction. We thought we would do maybe 20 minutes with some doctors who could tell us how it works. And what we had no idea would happen was that the call lines for Vermont Edition were absolutely flooded with people who were living with addiction or recovering from addiction to opioids, who called in to talk about their experiences with these drugs, with rehab and with treatment protocol. We wound up dropping the other two segments that we had planned, and we went the full hour just hearing people's stories about loss and renewal. And it's almost, I think, 7 or 8 years ago now, but very present still in my mind when Tropical Storm Irene hit the state. VPR, you also may remember, was slow on the uptake on that storm and how bad it was. But once we saw how devastating the damage was and how many people were just completely unable to communicate with their loved ones or find information, we basically discarded our normal format. We went live on Vermont Edition for an hour and a half or 2 hours every day at noon, all of that first week. And then at 7 p.m., instead of rebroadcasting the noon hour or 2 hours, we went live again. And the things that people told us were both heartbreaking and inspiring. I mean, sometimes it was just people saying, I need to get to a doctor's appointment and Route 4 is closed. Do you know how I can get there? I don't have any internet. And Ross Sneed, our news director at the time, was in the studio with me with a laptop, and he would just do some fancy finger work and look it up, and he'd say, oh yeah, I have a route for you. Here's how you can get from your house to Dartmouth-Hitchcock. And then he would repeat it slowly so the caller could write it down. And then 5 minutes later, someone would call in and say, you know, I'm actually headed to Dartmouth too. If you can be out at this road, at this intersection at 9 a.m., I can give you a ride that day. People would call in and express concern because they hadn't heard from their uncle in 3 days since the storm, and the phone lines were down, and there was no internet, and they couldn't figure out how to get in touch. And then half an hour later, we would get an email from someone else saying, Joe's okay. I saw him out at the edge of his house this morning. I'll tell him you're worried. One evening in that first week after the storm, there was a call for animal feed. The Pearly cows in South Royalton were out of food and in desperate need. And the call was, if they don't have food or feed by the next morning, we're going to be in trouble. And what do you know, the next morning, people were showing up with hay and pellets and driving their pickup trucks along the roads that they could to get feed to these cows. One woman wrote to us after things had settled down a little bit, and she said, every day at noon, my kids and dogs and I would get in our car and roll down the windows and sit there and listen to your broadcast. It was the only contact we had with the regular world until our roads were repaired, and it was our lifeline. It's a remarkable privilege to be the conduit for that kind of information and to have people in bad times and in good trust us with their questions, their concerns, and their stories. Although, I should admit, not everybody trusts me or opens up like Ruth Stone did. I think maybe my only claim to fame is that Bernie Sanders has hung up on me. It was about 8 years ago now, and we were doing an interview with the senator after he had sent out a letter after the shooting of Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. The Sanders team had released this letter condemning the attack, but attached to the end of it was a fundraising message entreating people to give to his re-election campaign. And as you can imagine, that did not go over well. And as I recall, Senator Sanders had refused to do any media interviews about this for several days until he finally relented and he said, I'll give one interview. I'm going to give an interview to Vermont Edition. So I interviewed him doing what we call live to tape the morning of the show. And live to tape is when we do an interview as if it's live. So we're trying to do it to fit the time we have, and we're not planning to go back and do any edits before we broadcast, but it isn't actually being broadcast as we do it. And as is the case with many political interviews, the guest, Senator Sanders in this case, had one agenda, and I had another. And they didn't quite match up this time. He wanted to talk about how Republicans were skewering him over this fundraising message, and if I just, quote, read the letter, I would realize what he was trying to say. I had read the letter, of course, and what I wanted to talk about was something that I found more troubling in it. Frankly, I thought the fundraising note was tone deaf, but it was more or less understandable. I figured that somebody on the Sanders team had taken a template. There's always a fundraising message in the end. It had gone out without somebody reviewing it, and it was sort of an oops moment, but not really a huge, huge deal. What I found more interesting in the letter was that Senator Sanders, through this letter, was ascribing a motive to the shooter, saying that the shooter had a sort of far right-wing ideological agenda. And he said that this was an assault on liberal viewpoints. At that point, we didn't actually know publicly the motive of the shooter. And so I wanted to ask Senator Sanders about that particular aspect of his letter, which I found troubling because it seemed like it was raising fear and anger before we knew all the facts. But Senator Sanders did not like that questioning, and although very polite, he just hung up on me. Click. And I remember how I said the interview was live to tape? We played it, the whole thing, including the hang up. My hunch is that he got some negative feedback for doing that, because in his next appearance on Vermont Edition several months later with me in the host chair, he was markedly more polite and friendly. At one point, I sort of accused him of being strident in his viewpoints. I know, a really off-the-wall suggestion. And he leaned forward and said softly, almost conspiratorially, "Strident, Jane, no. I'm a gentle soul." When I first got started in this job, as I said, I was 28, and it was 12 years ago, so that tells you how old I am now. And I was totally unknown in the Vermont media scene and unknown to Vermont politicians. And I think a 28-year-old woman can appear kind of unthreatening. This was a position I found I could use to my advantage when people in power underestimated my capability. I would ask a fairly simple question and smile gently, and then follow up with a hardball question that they weren't expecting. It worked like a charm. Does not work anymore. I am now a grizzled old-timer. But I do still employ some of the same tactics. A friend of mine says that he listens for a change in the tone of my voice when he hears it, and then he knows that I'm going to go for the jugular. He says that my voice gets very sweet and very high. And then I say something like, "You're having taxpayers pay for this junket to China because you say your presence will help lure investors. But Governor, why do people in China care who you are?" But we all need a break from politics sometimes. And if you listen to Vermont Edition, you probably can tell that I get really excited about anything having to do with animals. When I was a kid, I used to watch the show Wild America, and I really wanted to be the host, Marty Stauffer. He got to go on these great adventures and narrate wildlife documentaries. I think the equivalent these days would be the Wildcrats, who my kids definitely want to be. These days, I would like to be David Attenborough, but that's another story. So whenever I get a chance now to go on a wildlife adventure, I'll take it. And I think the Fish and Wildlife Department has figured this out. So whenever they have an exciting thing that they would like done, they give me a little tip like, oh, you could go out in the field. So I'm going to play you something. I want to do a little bit of guess the animal. So anyone know what makes this sound? Any guesses? Around here, you guys might know this. That's a little brown bat. I recorded that bat a couple years ago, not here, but actually over by a covered bridge that wound up burning down the following summer out on the Salisbury-Whiting line. And I'm going to play you a couple minutes of that story because it was one of my favorite ways to be able to get out of the studio and incorporate both reporting and sound. So here are a few minutes of that.
A muggy summer evening in Vermont, in a swampy area, just as the sun is going down and the mosquitoes are thick in the air. Might not sound like a good place to hang out, but it's ideal if you're a little brown bat or a bat researcher.
I would say of all the places I've been, the mosquitoes are definitely the worst here. You pull up in your truck and you'd better get in and out pretty quickly, or when you leave that night, you're going to have a truck full of mosquitoes.
Alyssa Bennett is the small mammals biologist for Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and on this particular muggy and buggy night, she was heading up a team of researchers, interns, and volunteers to study a population of bats in Addison County. A colony of little brown bats roost in a covered bridge over the Otter Creek each summer, and biologists have been studying them for almost a decade. Bennett and her team set up a couple different kinds of nets to trap the bats as they came out of the covered bridge and 2 nearby bat boxes. Most of the bats here are females and they're young. The males don't stay with the babies, so they're able to wander more than the females. Because they're mammals, they nurse their young. When the pups are first born, they stay in the nesting sites while their mothers go out hunting. But by late July, the pups are flying, or volant, and the whole colony comes out to feed on aquatic and flying insects. Pretty quickly after sunset, a few unlucky bats find themselves ensnared in a kind of trap called a harp net. The bats fly into the vertical strings of the harp net and slide down into a little plastic trough. 7 bats beat their little wings against the plastic sheeting, and the researchers hang back, hoping to catch a few more unsuspecting subjects. Another type of net, called a mist net, is set up in between some trees in a corridor that the bats often take from the bridge to a nearby field. Sweeping the light from her headlamp across the thin netting, Fish and Wildlife intern Jessica Ralston spots a bat and moves over to disentangle it.
Right now, I am trying to tangle this little fellow here, he's a bat, out from the net. Oh, it's a tricky process. This is actually my first time untangling a bat. He keeps getting his arms stuck though. Alyssa, I can't tell if this is around his neck or not. I don't want to hurt him. Just like, I got 3 parts of him free.
Oh, good. Okay, here, I'll take him.
You got him?
Yeah.
He's latched on to me right now.
I'll leave it there, but Alyssa Bennett later on in the piece says that when she's catching these bats in the nets, she sometimes looks at them and thinks what they might be thinking about this experience, and she imagines them going back to their friends later on and saying, "You're not going to believe it, I was abducted by these aliens. They had these lights and they spread out my wings," and that all of their friends would be like, "Yeah, right, whatever." I started following bat biologists the first winter that white nose syndrome was discovered in Vermont, which was the winter after it had been first discovered anywhere in this part of the world in New York. And my first experiences were right around here at Aeolus Cave, one of New England's largest hibernacula, at least it used to be. And that used to mean thousands upon thousands of bats flying in around this time of year to hibernate and then flying out again in the spring. And we went there in, I think, February, and there were bats flying out of the cave when they shouldn't have been, completely weakened, unable to fly straight, kind of falling into us and then hitting the snow and dying. We talked about bats just last week, though, on Vermont Edition. And although the little brown bat population in the Northeast has suffered a 90% decline, Researchers today think that there may be enough that are able to withstand the fungal infection to create a resistant population. And so it may not mean disaster for the bats. But I have felt really glad in some ways to be able to cover this story, even though I find it really depressing, because sometimes you do wonder, are these animals going to be all gone in 20 years? And what a remarkable thing to have been up close with them. I feel the same way about moose these days. It sounds like we may not have moose in 20 or 30 years in this part of the world. I'm going to give you another animal sound, and this one will not be hard to identify. It's a rattlesnake. A lot of people don't know that Vermont has populations of rattlesnakes, and I was so thrilled to get a chance to go out and see Vermont's rattlesnakes a few years ago. Living in California, we did encounter them fairly frequently, but when I was a kid, I had no idea that there were rattlesnakes here. And so it was really cool to be able to go out with fish and wildlife biologists and see them. Doug Blodgett was the biologist who I went out with, and he took me up this hill in Rutland County to release a snake that had been studied and microchipped. And then we went over to a rocky outcropping a couple miles away to check on the other population of snakes and to try to ascertain if they have a deadly fungal infection called snake fungal disease. Doug Blodgett has this laminated sheet that he keeps tucked up under the sunshade in his truck. And it has directions to the nearest hospitals with anti-venom, so that if anyone gets bitten, one of us can hop in his truck and drive the victim to New York or wherever the nearest anti-venom is, and hope that we can get there fast enough to save the extremity or the life of the person. I hadn't been scared about seeing the snakes until he showed us that laminated sheet. And then I blurted out in front of this group of about 5 dudes, "I'm pregnant!" Up until that moment, my husband and I had told maybe 2 people. So the Fish and Wildlife Department definitely gets a special honor. And I think I was just worried that if I was bitten, I'd need the anti-venom, and I didn't know how that would affect the baby. And it's funny how quickly your concerns change once parenthood comes into the picture, even before the kids are born. On this particular excursion, I did not get bitten by any rattlesnakes, nor did anyone else in our group, but I also could not find the darn things. I have tons of tape, like I had maybe 4 hours of tape when I got back, audio. And I have a lot of it where the biologists are saying, "Look," and I say, "Where?" And then they say, "There," and I say, "Where?" So here's a little bit from when we did find a rattlesnake hidden in a rock.
I'm pretty sure this is a female, and it might be pregnant or gravid. I don't see evidence of lesions or anything, but we'll digitally photograph it, and then we'll be able to blow that up and take a much closer look without bothering it.
So she's letting us know.
Yeah, so she knows we're here, and she's just telling us, "Okay, I'm over here." Yeah, that looks like a nice pregnant female there. Okay, let's back off a little bit.
Felt a little ironic to be bothering pregnant rattlesnakes at that moment. But it was very cool. And yet again, the possibility remains that these creatures won't be around forever given the diseases they face and the very small populations of them here in Vermont. And so, it's a wonderful thing for me personally to be able to see these creatures, but also to be able then to bring that to a wider audience and to be able to say, here are some of the issues that these animals are facing, and here's why you should care. Doug Blodgett told me during that interview that he thinks rattlesnakes in particular, but snakes in general, are perhaps the most hated creatures on Earth. And from his perspective, that's totally wrong. I would say coyotes are often pretty hated around here as well, but certainly rattlesnakes, people, if they found them, liked to just chop their heads off. I'm really tempted to spend the rest of my time just playing animal sounds for you, but I promise I won't except for one more. And I'm going to play you a little bit of a piece that I did where I got to marry my love of animals with my love of creating good, sound-rich pieces. One of the most time-intensive but gratifying parts of what I get to do is actually to take my voice out of a piece altogether and create what we call a non-narrated, sound-rich piece. We call them codas on Vermont Edition, and we used to do a lot of them. We do many fewer of them now. But most summers, I curate a series called Summer School, and they're 2 or 3 minutes of a piece where somebody else is giving us instruction in how to do something neat. And often it's not something particularly exciting, but the sound possibilities really bring you into their lives. I think one of the most fun ones I did was how to make a pickle. And you think that wouldn't be exciting, but I promise you it was. Early on, I got to do a piece at a place called the Family Cow Farm Stand in Heinsberg, Vermont. It was at the time run by Lindsay Harris and her partner, and so this is the piece that we did.
Today we're going to milk a cow. First, we have to wash our hands. Then we have to clean off the cow. We use these washable rags and some tit dip. That's the official name, tit dip. Good girl. This is Jemima. Jemima is a Jersey cow. She's about 6 years old or so. Okay, I think that's pretty good. So then we're gonna strip her, and that means milking out the first milk. She looks good, and we get rid of that, and then we dip her, and we're ready to go. And I'm sitting with my head on her flank on a little stool, and I've got my tail right under her. And the trick is that you gotta seal off the top with your thumb and forefinger, and then draw the milk out with the rest of your fingers. Gives it some pressure, and it makes a nice strong stream. If you just grab onto the whole thing at once and press it, then the milk goes back up into the other. And you don't really have to pull. Everyone thinks you gotta pull. It doesn't look like much, but when I'm hand milking every day, I look like Popeye. Hand milking is very hard work.
So that piece was about 1.5 minutes, but it was about 45 minutes of interviewing to get that final 1.5 minutes. And in a piece like that, where you're trying to put the sound and the story together, you try to get someone to do the interview clean with no sound, and then do the thing that they're describing without talking, which is very hard for them because they always want to narrate as they're doing it, and you have to keep reminding them, do but don't talk, and talk but don't do. And then you get to put them together. And in journalism, we would never put sounds that were not created at the time of the event, but because this is not a hard news piece, we're comfortable saying, say what you're gonna do and then do it, and then we get to marry those sounds together. And working with sound is, I think, probably my favorite part of working in radio and in public radio in particular. And it was the first thing that got me hooked on this career almost 20 years ago now, when I got hired to work on a show called Radio Expeditions. It was a co-production of National Geographic and NPR, and it doesn't exist anymore, partly because it was such an expensive show segment to produce. It was a series of stories that would air on Morning Edition over the course of a week, where the hosts and production team went out with explorers and scientists and adventurers around the world, and then came back and made these highly crafted, really sound-rich stories. And getting that job launched my career. I'll forever be grateful to Carolyn Jensen, who was the boss who hired me. She says, or said, that she found my resume in a pile of intern applications, but I had never applied for an internship at NPR. What I had done was have a conversation with the president and CEO at the time. I was a senior in college, and he said, send me your resume. I was a senior in college. I did not have a very appealing resume. But I think he said that just to get me off the phone and then threw it in a pile. But Carolyn found it, and she thought that I looked like an appealing candidate for an internship. I guess it was the combination of travel writing, which I had done for Let's Go Travel Guides, and a degree in anthropology. So she called the house in Cornwall, my parents' house, the same one where years later I would be getting out the head lice, and offered me a job. This was surprising to me, not only because I had not actually applied for the internship, but because at that moment I had no idea what I was going to do with my life, and I was in this very bewildering space. I had gone off after high school, after college graduation, to write part of a Let's Go travel guide in Spain. And this was immediately after graduation. I think I left the day after graduation. And 5 days into the trip, I got word that one of my best friends, Haley Surti, a fellow Let's Go travel writer, had been killed in a bus accident in Peru. I was totally crushed. I had gone to Spain because that's where she had spent her time abroad, and she had gone to Peru partly because I had studied abroad in Chile, and we had told each other these stories of these places and wanted to experience for ourselves what the other person had seen. So I was crushed. I came home. They offered us the opportunity to continue writing or to come home, and I probably should have stayed out, but I couldn't. I needed to be at Haley's funeral and to see her family and to see my family. So I left the book, and someone else took my place, and I went home to Philadelphia to see her family. And then I came back to my home in Vermont with no job on the horizon and no idea what I was going to do. So when Carolyn Jensen called and left a message with my stepmother, I actually thought that it was an ill-advised attempt by one of my friends to kind of cheer me up by saying, hey, we're going to get you a job at NPR. And I almost didn't call back because I thought it was a joke. But I did, and Carolyn offered me an unpaid internship in Washington, D.C., working on this amazing show called Radio Expeditions. And I said, I'm sorry, I cannot take an unpaid internship. I need to be making money. And she said, okay, we'll pay you. I did not get to travel with the team to these fantastic locations all over the world, but I did get to listen to all of the sound that they brought back from their adventures. And when I say sound, I mean, I told you 45 minutes maybe for that piece on milking a cow. This would be like 36, maybe 48, 60 hours of tape. And they'd bring them back, dump them on my desk, and then my job as the intern was to transcribe every minute of it. The most memorable experience from my year working on that show was when the team went to the Central African Republic to follow researchers who were learning about how elephants communicate. Elephants, they know now, have these very low frequency calls that they can make back and forth to one another over a distance of a mile or more. We can't always hear these calls, but the elephants can communicate very clearly over these long distances. And the researchers were studying what these calls mean and how elephants talk to one another. So when they got back, my job was to transcribe hours and hours and hours of elephant sounds, and then try to create a written transcript that would help Carolyn and her husband, the regular reporter of the series, Alex Chadwick, pick which sounds to include in these incredibly sound-rich stories. So what I was listening to that I had to transcribe sounded like this. I gave you 40 seconds. Imagine 40 hours of that. And my job was to write things like low grumble, loud grumble, long emphatic moan, over and over, 8 hours a day for weeks. It was both amazing and really tedious, kind of hilarious and heartwarming. And what it was most of all was a lesson in the power of sound and how, paired with really good writing, you can bring a story to life for your listeners. You can put them inside the scene. They can almost feel that chest rumbling sound of an elephant. Or, as I've done for my years in radio in Vermont, understanding what it feels like to be inside the debate over the F-35s. Or, when you add empathy to the mix, you get a different piece again. You can help your audience understand the grief of a parent who has lost a child to an opioid overdose, and how that human experience then connects us to policy and politics. That very first radio job, transcribing the sounds of elephants calling to one another across the distance, also gave me a lesson in what it's like to have a mentor and a boss who believes in you. In many ways, I think I owe my career to Carolyn Jensen, who became a friend. She died in 2010, but I have always carried her spirit and her energy with me in the hopes of continuing her legacy and working on sound and stories that mean something to people. And one of the ways that I've done that recently is actually by regressing back to a childlike state. In addition to Vermont Edition, I host this podcast called But Why? And you have to say it that way. My dad, who is not a child but sometimes acts like one, pointed out very early on that if you say it with the emphasis on the first word, it's more scatological. So you can't say but why if you're a 75-year-old or a 5-year-old, but you can say, but why? We've been making it for about 3.5 years now, and in that job, I get to incorporate all the values of public radio journalism, plus the awe and the curiosity and the really dogged inquisitiveness of children. If you haven't heard it, the way the show works is that kids send us questions. We have their adults record them on a smartphone using the technology that many of them have in their pockets. And then they send it to us, and we field the questions. And by we, I mean me and my co-producer, Melody Bodette. And we find interesting people to help answer them. So in the 3.5 years that we've been doing this, we've had more than 5,000 questions from kids in all 50 states and more than 50 countries. But Why is now the most popular thing that VPR makes. So we tackle everything with this idea that we should do it with respect, humor, and honesty, just the way adults would want to be treated. So we talk about why do your fingers and toes get wrinkly when you're in the tub for a long time? Or what does it feel like to die? Or why do flamingos stand on one leg? And even, is it ever okay to do something you've been told not to do and then never tell anyone that you did it? That was a fun episode. I am certainly not ready at this point to step away from the excitement and the adrenaline of live radio and hard news, but in some ways, making But Why is the culmination of everything that I love about making radio. And to make it for the next generation, the people who are going to inherit this world that we are giving them and then have to attempt to make it better. That's the highest form of journalism, to help instill in these kids a sense of curiosity and empathy and wonder and an idea that they can do it, that they have power over their own lives. So, sometimes we're just explaining why we poop, but I do feel like even in those stories, we are giving kids some of the tools that they may need. I have been really lucky to have the life and the career that I have, and to make that life and career in Vermont, where people are both kind and generous, but also hold media and journalists to a very high standard. And I will say, you really set a very high bar, and I'm grateful that at my best, you put your trust in me to share your lives and stories, and to grapple with some of the biggest issues that we all have to face together as communities and as Vermonters. So thank you. So I'd happily take questions if anybody has a question for me. I'm not going to explain why and how we poop. You can listen to the episode for that, but any other questions I'm happy to take. So the question is, has there ever been an assignment or an interview that I think, God, this is going to be boring, and then it turns out to be the opposite? I think a lot of the topics are like that, not by the time I'm walking into the interview, but when we first talk about them in our planning meeting. So for Vermont Edition, when we're fully staffed, which we're not right now, we have 3 producers and me, and we all get together on Wednesday afternoons, and we pitch each other ideas and then try to beat them up and see what's still standing at the end of the pitch meeting. And there are things like dairy pricing that I feel like I've had to cover 20 or 30 times in the past 12 years. And so we start by thinking, how the heck are we going to cover this in a way that makes sense to anybody and is interesting? And once we determine it is a newsworthy topic, then part of my job, the producer goes and has to do all of this research and find the right guests and figure out which angle we're going to cover. And part of my job is to find a way to be interested. Because if I go into that interview not interested, nobody else listening is going to be interested either. You can tell when a host doesn't care about the topic or isn't interested. And so I usually go in thinking, this is going to be fascinating. And it's more often the opposite of what you say, where I think, this is going to be so great. And then the interview falls a little flat, or I think, oh, I don't think people are as interested in that as I thought they would be. But yeah, frequently there are topics that we cover again and again that on the face of it, I think, ooh, really? Act 250 is one where it's like, I don't find that boring, but I think, how are we going to cover this in any way that's interesting? And then if it seems like it's really boring, or if the producer, I think the producers on my show find me a little bit intimidating because I really like to fight with them in the planning meeting. So, if they can't find a way to make it interesting even for 3 minutes in the planning meeting, then we're probably not going to tackle it. So I hope never to get into the studio thinking, this is going to be a real bummer of a show. Do we have to get approval from anyone before we do the programs, and are there any topics that are off limits? There are no topics that are off limits. There are some topics we don't typically cover at VPR, and I think Vermont Edition sticks pretty close to that. We don't typically do crime stories. We do when they rise to the level of statewide news or statewide interest, but we don't typically cover just straight crime. On Vermont Edition, we have a pretty strict mission that we adhere to, that's just an internal one, of only doing shows where either the topic or the guest has a really strong connection to our region, because we feel like we can't compete with On Point or The Takeaway or any of the national programs that have more resources to do the same stories. And we actually call it, when we started, we called it the Barbara Rule, and that has evolved over the years to the Beyonce rule and now the Cardi B rule. And the idea is, if Barbara Streisand or Beyonce or Cardi B came to Vermont, would Vermont Edition try to interview that person? And while all of us would love to do those interviews, the answer is no, because that person doesn't have a strong enough connection to Vermont, and so it's not our story. So that's we feel the only way that we're going to keep Vermont Edition relevant and good and interesting enough to our audience that they're going to care to stick around with us rather than wait to hear it on Fresh Air. So nothing is off limits, but there are things we don't typically cover. And we're pretty self-contained staff. We don't really have to run our topics by anybody because, again, when we're fully staffed, we have a managing producer or senior producer. And so that person is a very experienced editorial person. So they're the ones who give sign off on the ideas. And I've done this now for almost 20 years. And so we tend to stand on, am I comfortable doing the interview? And is the managing producer or senior producer also comfortable with what we're doing? And if we can pass both of those people, then we're fine doing it. There have only been, I think, 2 times in my career that I have felt uncomfortable with the way we're handling an interview. And one of them was doing an interview with a board member who had written a book. And the book was very topical and very relevant, but I felt a little uneasy with the idea that this was directly selling books, and this person was a VPR board member. So we passed that through the editorial chain, and our CEO gave sign off, and I didn't do that interview. And then another one was, we do often, well, occasionally these days, interview the CEO, and I'm comfortable with that. But if we're going to interview the CEO of our own organization on a news show, I want to make sure that there is cover for the host, that I can ask anything that I want, even if it's a question that our president and CEO might not want to answer, and that I'm not going to get in trouble for that. And I think everybody's comfortable with that idea, but we've never actually sat down with the staff and with our marketing and communications department to say, if we're going to do this program, there has to be complete editorial freedom for the news department to ask questions that you may not want to be asked. So we haven't tackled that. It's been coming up lately because we have a relatively new president and CEO. Should Vermont Edition do a show with him? Should we do it outside of the program? And I'm happy to do a conversation with him, but it will be a news interview in the same way that we would do with anybody else. So perhaps they don't want to do that. A typical workday. So a typical workday for me is I get up at 6:20 and spend an hour running around, very harried, trying to get my son on the bus, which he never wants to get on, and then get my daughter to daycare and get our dog walked. And then I get to work around 9, and I usually have the notes for the show that we're doing the night before. So after I put my kids to bed, I spend about an hour reading notes for the next day's show. So when I get into the office at 9, I should be pretty set on what we're talking about and what the show looks like. But that may be the first time that I have a chance to talk with the producer of the show about, why do you want this guest here? Could we move this guest to the second part of the show? Or frequently, and I think the producers again hate me for this, I am a real stickler for pronunciation and pronouncers in the notes so that we know exactly how to say everybody's name. And so I'll say, do you really mean the emphasis on this syllable? And if I had my druthers, I would give every new radio producer a 2-hour lecture on how to write pronouncers because nobody can do it. And it's a big deal. I mean, you want to get people's names right. So I chat with the producers. We have a news team-wide meeting for about 15 minutes at 10 where all of the reporters are in the room or on the phones, and we all talk over what the topics for the day are. And then I write a script, which is basically just the open of the show. So we have what we call a billboard, which is the 1 minute that you hear before the newscast that has music under it. That is taped. We do that at about 11:45. And then the rest of the show is typically live. So I'll start the show and say, today on Vermont Edition, we're going to talk about access to justice and what that means and why this new report says for every $1 spent on legal services for people who can't afford them, $11 are poured back into the economy. How is that possible? So that's live, but that's scripted. And then we go into the interview, and I have a set of questions that I've written, and I try to think about an arc to the conversation. I want there to be a beginning and an end. I want people to feel like they can go through the journey. It doesn't always happen. And then end with something that feels like a conclusion. But I typically don't read from the questions. Once I've written them, they're enough in my head that I know kind of where we want to go, and then I can throw them out. Because it turns out the hardest thing about hosting a show is actually listening to the conversation as it's happening, which should be easy, but I'm usually sitting in a studio. I've got a screen here that has a chat window so the producers can chat to me or pop an email on the screen that's come in or a tweet from someone. And we have 6 call lines. And so our call screener is putting in the first name, the town, and then about 7 or 8 words of what that caller might want to say. And so if we have all 6 of those lined up, I'm trying to see, which call is relevant to what we're talking about now, or is there an email that's come in that they've put on my screen, or are they telling me, don't go to line 4, our guest isn't there, which they can do in my ear as well. And so that makes it rather complicated to actually listen to the questions and the answers as they're coming in and listen to what people are talking about. So I find that the hardest. And then after the show, I feel like collapsing, but I don't. And we do a debrief, and then I get to work on other topics, other interviews that we might be doing, or the podcast. I have about 10 hours a week to work on, but why? That's a pretty typical day. Yeah, so how's VPR changing and growing, and what directions are we shifting in? Is there actually more investigative reporting now than there used to be? We hired an investigative reporter, Emily Corwin, a couple years ago, and so we have a dedicated reporter whose job is to do investigative reporting. So in that way, yes, we've decided that's a priority. I'm a little confused at the moment about exactly which direction we are going, because there have been a lot of ideas floated, and we're in transition at the moment in terms of trying to figure out who we want to be and what we can be. We did a listening tour around the state last year with our new CEO, Scott Finn, and what we heard from people was that they want more reporting on their own communities. And so we hear that, and we want to give more of that, but also recognize that we're never going to be in every community. I mean, we don't have the money for that, and I don't think it would be an efficient use of the statewide network to be in every small town. And so for Vermont Edition, one of the ways that I'm thinking about it is how can we better coordinate with other reporters in other organizations that are working in local communities. And we've gotten away from doing interviews with people at the Bennington Banner or the Caledonian Record, and I would like to get back to that, because I think if you have connections to people who are doing the reporting on the ground in their communities, they know the stories best, and we're never going to be in every community. So how can we find those ties if VPR isn't going to have a reporter in every county? Scott Finn told Pointer, the national news organization, in a publication that came out a couple days ago that we'd like to have a reporter in every county, and that was news to me. So if that happens, I think it would be great. I worry a lot about the consolidation of the news media in general, but even at VPR, I live in Addison County. Most of our newsroom lives in Chittenden County, at least the ones that are based in Colchester. And so I find myself often saying, that's not the way it's playing out in Addison County, or that's not the conversation we're having in rural towns. That it feels very different for me, some of the issues, school consolidation, for example. In my county, there's a lot of talk about that. And even in my town of Moncton, questions about what are we going to do about declining enrollment and how can students be best served. That's not the same conversation that's happening in Winooski and Burlington. And so I worry that if we have reporters only in certain places, that those are the perspectives that are loudest. So I don't quite know where we are or where we're going, but I think VPR is aware of that problem and that potential lack of awareness of what's happening all over the state and how to have these conversations. And I think in the next year or two, you'll see more reporters in other parts of the state and different partnerships with other news organizations so that we can cover places where we don't have reporters. If I had never called back for the internship, would I be where I am now? No, for sure not. I was really at loose ends at that particular moment, but I thought I might go to art school and do some kind of art. When I was younger, I had 3 requirements for what I wanted in my life, in a job and in a career. I wanted to be able to travel, I wanted to be able to write, and I wanted to make enough money to survive. And I have always been able to find 2 out of 3, and have never been able to find 3 out of 3. And at this point, the hard part for me is I've been here for 12 years, and this is home, and that's wonderful in a lot of ways, but it's been hard to nail my feet to the floor and decide to stay in one place and form a life here. And the way that I have approached that, knowing that that I was going to be here for a while and that I probably will be here for a while longer, is to still think about adventures, but to think of them as micro-adventures. And so I used to write, before I had kids, I wrote a little nature writing blog that I called The Common Wanderer. And the idea was to find awe and adventure in the smallest, most close by places. And so, I would go outside in the morning on a rainy day and you look down at the driveway and there are thousands of earthworms that are out because it's a rainy morning. And that's such a commonplace thing that you could just walk by and step over them and run over them with your car as you head down the driveway. And I thought, well, this is how I'm going to keep myself interested in where I am and not need to leave, is by saying, wait a minute, what are they actually trying to do? Why are they out? Are they getting flooded? Or, what's happening? And so then I would do some research, and my recollection is that the best guess is that they actually can move faster up on land, but they can't do it when it's dry. And so when it rains, it's like, ooh, everybody get out, we can go on the highway. And they'll cross from place to place. Or, what's the deal with woolly bear caterpillars? What happens to them? And it turns out inside their bodies, they have a thing like antifreeze. So they hibernate, but they don't really hibernate underground. They don't need their bodies to be warm. They just curl up in a ball, and this antifreeze goes through their bloodstream to prevent moisture from getting into their blood and killing them, and then they wake up in the spring and they can live for a couple of years, which I never knew. So that's sort of how I've decided to have a life that involves adventure, now that I have 2 kids and a husband that I also have to keep in mind, instead of just saying, I think I'll go to Iceland. I think that's probably all the time that we have. I'm happy to take more questions, and I'll hang around here if anybody has any that they'd like to ask me personally. But thank you so much for being here and for being with us tonight.